Unfound is brought to you by its supporters at Patreon, PayPal, and YouTube, along with its gracious advertisers. Barbara McCray was an 83-year-old from Buchanan, Georgia. She had a huge family and lived with one of her sons. On the evening of July 31st, 2021, Barbara went for a stroll along the road in front of her home. A relative driving by saw Barbara during this time. She was never seen again. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. The topic of searches is something that has come up on virtually every episode that Unfound has ever done. Whether we're talking about jets going missing like with Ben Padilla or Flight 370, or people out on the water like the Marco Island 3 or the Pickering 6, or the more regular disappearances we cover on this podcast on a weekly basis. Some of those would include David Hardy Jr., an elderly gentleman whose disappearance is very much like ours today. Robert Cox, a guy who allegedly took off on his own, but his physical abilities would seem to say otherwise. Shelva Rafty, a woman who disappeared somewhere between her boyfriend's place and her own, or did she? Shanna Boydo allegedly ran away from her boyfriend's car, although I'm not sure how many people believe that. And Unfound has covered many, many more like these. Sure, maybe these people didn't wander away. Maybe all of these cases were foul play. Still, that doesn't change the fact that searches should be done. Well, with the disappearance of Barbara McCray, she had dementia. She was 83. She was allegedly out there on a road alone. In her case, what exactly qualifies as walking distance? And now a summary of the case. You will not find this disappearance on the Charlie Project or on NamUs. Barbara McCray lived in Georgia her whole life. Why would she have moved when she had so much family around her? If you can believe this, Barbara had 4 children, who in turn gave her almost 20 grandchildren, who in turn had over 20 great-grandchildren. Crazy numbers. And most of them were in that area of Georgia. Barbara's husband died in 2009, and her one son, Todd, moved in to help her out. Everything was fine. However, in 2019, Barbara had been diagnosed with dementia. She took the news well, and at the point of her disappearance, had not exhibited any of the major signs associated with the disease. So on the evening of July 31st, 2021, Barbara, as she had done many times, went out for a walk. Despite her mind being in a state of degradation, her body worked fine. She was not headed anywhere in particular, and Barbara had plenty of time to get home before dark. A nephew of Barbara's even saw her on the road around 6:30 p.m. Yet Barbara never returned to her house. She was never seen again. The next day, a search using many people on foot and on ATVs with the help of dogs combed the area where Barbara was last seen. Nobody found any signs of her at all. Until people get GPS chips implanted, and I'm not saying I'm for that, but until that happens, searches will always be very hit and miss. But do they have to be? Or does there have to be a genuine back-to-basics rethinking of how searches are done? Contemplate that as you try to answer these 3 questions during the interview. Number 1, can we be sure the nephew saw Barbara on the correct date? Number 2, why wasn't 911 called until the next day? And number 3, is Barbara still missing due to the unsuccessful searches, or could it be something else? Barbara's family isn't sure what to think and is open to all possibilities. The guest for this episode is Barbara's granddaughter, Amy Coleman. Unfound News. The merchandise store is open. Please check it out at unfound-podcast.myspreadshop.com. Once again, unfound-podcast.myspreadshop.com. And if you don't see something specific there, email me at unfoundpodcast@gmail.com, and we will try to make it available. Next, the upcoming episode of Unfound Now is done. But right now, only Patreon and YouTube members can watch it. So please consider joining up at either supporter site. Finally, I'm getting closer to the release of my teachable course, How to Podcast Better Than Anyone. Please look for some ads and other marketing items as we get closer to the release date. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the granddaughter of Barbara McCray, Amy Coleman. Amy, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Let's start here, as we usually do when we have family members on Unfound as guests. Let's talk about your family as a whole. You are a granddaughter, but how many children does Barbara have? And then if you can do the quick calculation in your mind, you of course are a granddaughter. How many other grandsons or granddaughters does Barbara have? I get the feeling it's a pretty big family, but why don't you tell the listeners?
Okay, so there's 4 kids, Jeff, Scott, Vicky, and Todd. Vicky, of course, is my mother. And then there is, I would say, 25 grandkids.
Wow.
Or let's see.
Wow. 25 grandkids.
Let's see, hold on. That's wrong. 25 great-grandkids.
Okay. All right. Big family here.
13 grandkids and 25 great-grandkids.
Wow.
13 and 25 great-grands, yes.
Well, okay, so I have to ask Amy, how many kids do you have? How many kids do you contribute to all of that?
I have 3 kids myself, 2 grandkids.
And then and so you have 3 kids, and then you already have grandkids, and I know how old you are, so I'm not going to broadcast that to the world. But you already have a couple grandkids yourself.
Yes.
Look at you. Okay, wow, that is a huge family there in the Cedartown, Georgia area, right?
Yes.
Wow, okay. All right, so, and how many, maybe off the top of your head, how many brothers and sisters did your grandmother Barbara have, or still has?
She has 1 still living, 1 sister living, and 1 brother that is deceased.
Okay, so,
Brother.
all right,
Sorry,
so.
1 when he was a teenager, so.
Okay, so it's been a while. Okay, so huge family. And would you say that all of you are fairly close? For example, do you have like a family reunion every few years, or what would you say?
We are not as close as we used to be back when, I would say both of my grandparents were, my grandfather was living and my grandmother, and my grandmother was, of course, still here.
Yeah.
Of course, we, family Christmas at my uncle's house every year. When when my grandfather was alive, we would have a family trail ride where everybody would get together. And not only family would come, other people would come to that. My granny was always a part of that. And they would just go out and ride horses and things like that. And we would do that every year up until my grandfather passed in 2009.
Okay.
But, of course, we have family dinners every year with grannies.
Okay. All right, so we have this huge family. I mean, just crazy, crazy huge family. But maybe not as close, like you said, as used to be. You had a grandfather. I guess this is Barbara's husband who died in 2009?
Yeah, ex-husband.
Ex-husband,
Yes.
Okay. So he died back then. It's been some years, so 14 years ago. And maybe since then, it's kind of hard to keep everybody together. Everybody's, especially these days, people move away, things like that. Okay. Let's move on to this. Let's just talk about your grandmother herself. I know for myself, I was very fortunate. I grew up only 1 yard away from one set of grandparents that I had. What about you? How often did you get to see your grandmother, Barbara? How often did you talk to her? How close were you to her? What were some of those things you would say? Amy?
Well, I went here the most recently before she went missing. I would go eat with her and my mom occasionally at Cracker Barrel. My mama would pick her up at least and take her to eat. So I would go with them to that. We probably had a closer relationship when I got in high school and, got a car and could go out, and I'd go out and meet her for lunch. And Granny she was the backbone. She was always there. She was so selfless. She helped, any of us. If we ever needed her help, she was always there. And so we were closer probably back, then when I was in high school. I moved away to California.
Wow.
In my early 20s, I got married, and my husband at the time was stationed at 29 Palms, so I lived in California for a little while, and then later on, I had moved back for a few years, but then I ended up moving to Kansas, because we got stationed there at one point. So I've kind of been back and forth. I have been back here for maybe 12 years, and so I have seen her. Of course, I would see her mainly at family get-togethers, and now I did stay with her some when I was pregnant with my second kid. I would stay with her some then, so probably when I was younger, and then when I got in my 30s, I probably just was busy being a mom. Life just gets busy.
It does.
And then, of course, we live, about 20 or 30 minutes away from where she lived, because she lived in Felton, and we live in Cedartown. We grew up here, and the majority of my cousins all live in Felton or lived growing up in Felton. So, they were probably all more closer to her just because they lived around her. So they got to see her, I feel like, of course, more than we did.
Okay. What kind of personality did your grandmother Barbara have? Kind of laid back, reserved, kind of maybe fiery? How would you describe her?
She was definitely, I would say, laid back. But she was very stubborn, as well, as far as, I know, it definitely come out when she got dementia. We would want, my mom wanted her to stay at her house and brought her here. But as soon as she got a chance, she was ready to go home. She walked to the neighbor's house. Hey, can you take me to my house? She was very, stubborn. Even up until she went missing, she wanted to be at her house. But she was a fiery little lady. Now, if you got her upset, she would let you know. But again, she was selfless and, the sweetest lady. you can imagine.
Okay. What were some of her interests? What did she do in her spare time? Things like that. Hobbies? What was she into?
Well, I know back, when she could get out and go and do stuff, I know she would spend time with her grandkids. That was important, spending time with us was important to her. She took care of cats, stray cats if they come up, and that was any time. Taking care of people really, has been a big part of her life. Even, I remember back, I don't even feel like she really had time, sometimes to go home and do other things because she would spend her day sitting with people who had Alzheimer's or dementia, things like that, older people that, were in the same situation that she was in when she went missing.
Right. And maybe you should remind the listeners, how old was she when she went missing?
83.
All right. So, not a youngster, maybe even possibly the oldest person we've ever covered as a disappearance on Unfound. I would have to check that to make sure, but certainly one of the oldest. And so she's 83 years old. We also have to remind the listeners that this is a fairly recent disappearance from 2021. Okay. And what is your understanding of, what was her daily schedule? Of course, she's into her 80s. What did she do when she got up in the morning? We're going to get how she was living with her son Todd, but what is your understanding of her daily activities? What was she into? Watch TV, or what did she do?
She just, I don't even know if she had a working TV, honestly, but I just know she would get up and spend the day. I'm sure they probably do. Have a TV. I said that, but she would probably get up, watch TV, and like I said, just spend time with the cat. She always has had animals inside that she would sit and tend to. So, and as far as I know, from what I've gathered, is that she just got up and just would stay home, except for the days that she would want to get out and take a walk.
Okay, so once again, 80-some years old. My dad is 86 years old. He's actually still physically and mentally able. He still drives places every day. He goes sees her friends, but we realize that not all 80-year-olds are like that. A lot of factors, illnesses and things can factor in. Of course, we know it's, the average age of a person in the United States. You're very lucky to even get into your 80s. Okay. So let's move on to this. You've already kind of mentioned it. Dementia. How long it had been going on? Was it officially medically diagnosed? How bad was it? What can you say about that, Amy?
So she had it for about 2 years. She was diagnosed by a doctor with it. And it just, when we were around her, probably just a couple months before she went missing, she was in her right mind. She would get confused and mixed up. But as far as knowing her name, where she lived, things like that, she always seemed to know those things. It was, would tell stories, like the day she went missing, I know she went to my mama's cousin's house and cleaned out his building, but she said she was cleaning the building out for her son, Jeff. And I know that because his wife had picked her up that day around lunch and took her home. She tried to take her to her house, but like I said, she's stubborn and refused. For the most part, she was there. She would just get confused. And then like my mom said, she would tell stories. She told people that President Trump was our cousin and he lived in Cedartown. And she would tell the same story to different people, but it's like we knew that, the story was wrong. But she would have that same story and tell it to, different people. And my mama verified that because she said, I heard her tell the same story. two other people. And I was like, that's not, they knew that wasn't right.
Okay. All right. So she was telling some stories, got confused. These are things that are not unusual for any family member or friend. You've had friends that have this kind of condition. How did she react, maybe, if it was 2 years, let's say she was diagnosed, let's say in 2019, 2018, 2019. How did she react to that? How did she handle that news? Of course, that can be, there's no cure, of course, we know, for dementia or Alzheimer's. How did she react to it? Do you even know?
I wasn't there with her. I don't know. I know my cousin Missy was usually the one that would take her to her doctor's appointments. So she would be the one that would know of her initial reaction. But I imagine she was probably shocked and scared. I know that would be my to finding out, that I had something that was gonna really forget or confuse you on who the people are that love you and know you and that you love and know.
Right. Right. I think this is just something, of course, we need to maybe understand, given the circumstances of the disappearance. And we've had a couple disappearances that we've covered on Unfound where people had been diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's, or something, something along those lines. I do have to bring this up, though. She did, at some point, put a dog in a car. And, once again, we don't like talking about negative things like that, but just maybe to give an example, maybe, of where her mind was. Did she leave a dog in a car and the dog died? Did that happen?
Yes, so the story I overheard the story at my aunt's house that she had went over. One of my cousin's kids was working on a car at his grandmother's house, which is across the street, and which would be my Uncle Scott's house. And she went over, sat in the car. I don't know if anybody actually saw her sitting in the car, but it was about 2 weeks later when he went to work on the car again, and that was when they found the dog. And they, knew the dog was missing, but the area is just a big wooded area, so they didn't think, they thought either the dog ran off, somebody could have shot the dog because it went up on their land,
Wow.
There was, there's a lot of different reasons, I guess that they weren't out looking for it. And then they, he went to work on the car, and that was when they found it. Other people's cars around that time. She got one of my cousin's cars and took all the paperwork or something out, or all of her stuff out one time. So that was how they come to the conclusion that it had to have been Granny who got in the car and didn't realize the dog was in there and left it.
Okay. Well, that's very sad. Okay, but all right. But to your knowledge, did your grandmother, Barbara, ever, for example, kids or grandkids show up and she didn't know who they were? Just as an example.
No, not that I know of. The only time I know of, like my Aunt Sandy said that, she had picked her up that day and she was calling my cousin Keith, her, Jeff or whatever, her son. But as far as when we would pull up, like anytime I was around her, she knew who I was. She knew who my mama was. Yeah.
Okay. All right. We have to remember, of course, dementia, these conditions, sometimes people can go downhill very, very fast. And then sometimes it's, it takes a lot longer to get to the point where they don't know the people around them. It's just, it's still a very big mystery as far as medicine is concerned. All right, let's move on to this. How did it come to be? Of course, she has a few children, but how did it come to be that her son Todd was the one that was living with her? We just talked about him in general terms. How did those two come to live together? Why wasn't she living by herself, or why wasn't somebody else living with her? Or maybe even her living with, like, your mother or somebody in her house. How did it come to be that Todd was living with Barbara?
So, on and off, since I can remember, he has lived with my granny. He would move out, like, you know, he's been married several times. So the only time I really know of him moving out, and I think maybe one time that he was married, he actually still lived with her, but that's the only times I've known of him moving out. Other than that, the only time he lived by himself that I can remember, it was probably in the 80s when I was, you know, a little kid.
Girl. Okay.
He lived next door to her at that point. And then I don't know what happened to, he lived in a single wide trailer, so I don't know whatever happened to him, you know, living there, if it just became an unlivable spot or what, but he was the one that just always lived with her on and off. He's the baby. So kind of doted on him, I feel like, a little more in his kids than, you know, everybody else. But, you know, my mom, Scott, and Todd, they all have their own houses and everything, so that was why none of them live with her, or she didn't live. And the reason that she didn't live with my mama after her being diagnosed with dementia is because, you know, she did try to bring her to her house, but, you know, she didn't want to be there. And I guess they wanted her to be comfortable. And I guess they felt like, you know, she wasn't going to be, and she wasn't going to try, you know, stay there unless she was at her house. And unfortunately, you know, nobody got to step in time and do anything, you know, before she went missing. So.
Okay. How did you, and once again, I'm not saying you were there personally, but how did Todd react to this diagnosis of her being diagnosed with dementia? And, you know, how was he, in your family's opinion, how was he taking care of her after this diagnosis?
From what I understand, you know, like, he insisted that he would take care of her.
Okay.
We, you know, like I said, we all insisted that, you know, that we would help. Mama tried to bring her up here. But he insisted he would take care of it. Him and Misty were the main two, you know, taking care of her.
And Misty is who? Misty is who?
Misty is his daughter.
Okay, Todd's daughter. Okay. All right, so after this, not much changed. After this diagnosis, things kind of just stayed the same. That those two were living there together, and that's the way it was.
Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to this. Now, my understanding is not only did your grandmother live in here, but she had some rental properties that she collected rent on. You know, was this before she went missing? As far as you understand, how was that money being managed? You know, of course, with dementia, it's one of the things you worry about. People start not taking care of their finances. What is your understanding regarding, once again, before she went missing, how that was all being taken care of?
So as far as I know, her or Todd, one I'm guessing, would collect the money. From what I understand, you know, Todd is in charge of those rental properties and collects the money on them, which I'm thinking there might be only one that's rented out currently. So, but he would still be, you know, as far as I know, before she went missing, he would have been in charge of getting that money and paying bills, you know, taking care of her, things like that with it.
Okay.
Now, what actually happens, we don't know, but from what I understand, that is how it is.
Okay. And maybe going, you know, in regards to, once again, her medical diagnosis, you know, was she getting good care since that? Was she going to see a doctor after that? Was she able to pay her bills? I realize we have Medicare and all that, but was she able to take care of all of that, given her finances?
Yeah, as far as I know, yes. I don't know of her being, you know,
she wasn't destitute or anything.
No.
Okay. Let's move on to one more thing, and because this kind of also, you know, very much is a topic of this disappearance. Your grandmother Barbara liked to walk. When and where? Did other family members live close? Would she walk there, or did she walk to a friend's house? What is your understanding regarding her liking to go out and walk? And I understand she even liked to go out and walk when the weather wasn't even quite that nice. What can you tell the listeners about her walking habits?
So she did love to go out and walk. My Uncle Scott and Aunt Louise live across the street from her. They're the only house really within probably, I don't know, at least a quarter to a half of a mile of her house.
Okay.
So, and I would say, so she would walk over there. That was where she left the dog in the car. She would walk to my Aunt Sandy's. From what I understand, she would walk through the woods because there's trails to go from each of my uncle's houses to the other. So she would get in the woods. She would walk in the woods on the trails from one house to another. She could climb fences or gates or whatever. Yeah, she was in shape old lady, I guess. She was out there,
Okay.
out there walking and.
Okay.
But she would, like my aunt said, she would always go home. She knew where her house was. So that's one thing about her going out and walking is that she would always go home, and that she did always know where her home was. And that was another reason why my mama was hesitant about trying to make her stay in Cedartown, is because if she did go out walking in Felton, she knew the area. She had been there all her life. She would know how to get back home. Versus if she was out walking, my mom lives out in the country, where she lives, where we live. But if she was to get out walking out in the country out there, she's not going to know where she's at. She's going to be more confused. I could see her side of that, as far as not wanting to make her stay or try to keep her here.
I have to ask, during any of these prior walks that she had ever been on, did she ever get lost? Did anybody ever have to go looking for her? Anybody have to go pick her up in a car, to your knowledge?
No. She would always go back home.
Okay. All right, so she's walking out there, and like you said, your understanding is even though her mind had been diagnosed as, of course, deteriorating, physically she was in pretty good shape.
Yes.
Okay. Let me just ask you some questions. They, of course, the listeners know that we follow an outline for every interview we do on Unfound, and these are questions now that Amy knows will be coming. And I also want to state that we are doing this interview on February 25th of 2023. How often were you, let's just say, seeing and or talking to her at this time, Amy, you personally, yourself?
I just saw her occasionally when I would go eat with her and my mom. Probably just, maybe a few times over the last year.
Okay.
As far as talking to her on the phone, my uncle had taken her phone at, whatever point after she was diagnosed, so nobody really had a way to contact her unless she went to her house, and there was a dog that would literally bite anybody that come up to her house. That was why people didn't really go over and visit her, and spend time with her, because obviously, you've got this dog that is not put up or,
Okay. Do you think your one of her grandchildren, do you think any of her other grandchildren were seeing her more often?
I'm sure they were. I know Misty probably was, being as, she was helping Todd take care of her. And I'm sure his kids probably went over there to visit him. So I'm sure they see her, when they went to visit, him. Okay.
Do you have any idea how often your mother was seeing her?
I know she was, if not more than once a month, I know she was at least seeing her once a month, to take her out and go eat and things like that.
Okay. Maybe I should ask you this then. Next question. Any other maybe people checking in to make sure that Todd and Misty, his daughter, were doing a good job of taking care of her, being that she had been diagnosed with? Anybody kind of like just checking in to make sure things were going as they should?
Well, I think, I'm sure people were probably checking in. I think, I think it's probably always been a concern with him being the one taking care of her, only because out of all of the kids, to us or to me, he is probably the least responsible,
Okay.
So he,
Okay.
But, and I hate to say that, but
That's just a fan. That doesn't mean it. That doesn't mean it's true. That's just a family perception.
Right.
All right. Okay. So, all right. Just want to make that clear. You're not making a value judgment. That's just your opinion.
Right.
Okay. All right. So there was some uncertainty there. So let's move on to this. In your opinion, was a change about to be made regarding the living and care arrangements?
Not from. I know I had heard. My mom and my aunt talk about, things needing to be done, but I don't think because of Granny wanting to stay in her house, I don't think they had anything set in motion, or planned at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think after the fact now that everybody wishes they had stepped up and done something a lot,
Okay.
sooner.
Well, we're all we're concerned about is any plans of changing the way things had been for years. That, for example, you might bring in a part-time nurse to check in on her, to stay with her, because that's kind of what my mother had for a while before she died, or move her to another place. Was there any solid plans like that, or talk about trying to make that happen?
When she was first diagnosed, my Uncle Jeff actually offered to fix up the rental house that is currently being rented out for her.
Mm-hmm.
Hire 24-hour care for her, but that was, at that point, from my understanding, my Uncle Todd had rented the house out without letting anybody else know, so the house was never fixed up for her.
Okay, so I guess what we're saying then is if she doesn't go missing, the anticipation is not much would have changed. It would have been her living with Todd, and that's the way things would have been.
Right. Unfortunately, I think that's how it would have been.
Okay, let's move on to one last question. Then we will get to the day what is accepted as the date of her disappearance. Regarding anybody. The last time somebody saw or talked to her that you trust, who would that last person be who saw her or talked to her before she went missing that you trust?
That would have been my Aunt Sandy, that seen her the day she went missing and took her home around lunch. When she picked her up, she did say she was sweating really bad, and she told her she didn't feel good that day. And Sandy told her, you need to go in and lie down and get some rest. And then, of course, later that evening was when my cousin Zach saw her walking down the road.
Okay.
But Sandy would have been the last person.
Okay, we'll get to that sighting in a little bit. And your understanding is that is July 31st, 2021?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so let's move up to that day. So your Aunt Sandy and Barbara were together that date, July 31st, 2021.
Yes.
All right, did they go anywhere? Did they go to Cracker Barrel, or what did they do?
No, she just had picked her up. She saw her, I guess, at my cousin Keith's house when she was going down the road. So she stopped and picked her up because obviously she knew she was not at the right house. And she just took her to her house, and that would, of course, she wasn't feeling well, so she told her to go in and lay down and rest. And then she went on home. She did try to get my grandmother to go home with her, but she refused. She wanted to be at her house.
Okay, all right. As many older people do at that age, know that. All right. So then, what is then the story for the rest of that day, July 31st, 2021? We know this is kind of up for a little bit of speculation, but what is your understanding? So your aunt leaves, Barbara is there. So there was some sort of sighting, allegedly. We'll come back to this later, but was there a sighting of her walking?
Yes. my cousin Zach saw her walking around 6:30 that evening. In the area she was walking in or towards, there's not really any houses. There's some big power lines that run, off the side of the road. So it's just kind of like really a wooded area, except for, it's cleared out for the power lines. But for the most part, there wasn't any houses where she was seen walking. She was kind of in an area where she was in between the houses, I guess.
Okay, so she was walking on a road, though.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, she was on the road.
All right, we have to remember this is July. It doesn't get dark till after 8 o'clock. And so it's daylight out. She's walking out there, even though it seems that she was having maybe some sort of issue earlier in the day, but we're going to come back to this sighting later. This place where she was allegedly seen, how far would you say this was from her house in miles?
I would say no more than a mile.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
Pretty close.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And seemingly, she went on this walk and seemingly never came back. Seemingly.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So that is July 31st. She's out there in the evening allegedly. And that is how this disappearance gets started. Let's move on to August 1st, 2021, coincidentally, my birthday. Who was the first person to kind of alert everybody, kind of say, hey, something's not right here regarding Barbara? How did that all get started that next day?
So for us, my cousin Keith, who my grandmother had just went and cleaned his garage, his building out the day she went missing. He is the one that actually called my brother. My brother's name is David. David was working in California because he contracts out and does contract work. So he was in California. He called my mom when she got out of church around lunchtime on August 1st. And he was actually the one that told my mom that she was missing.
How did he find out?
He found out from her cousin, Keith, the one that my granny had went to his house the morning she went missing and cleaned out his building. Okay. He was the one that called my mom.
And how did he find out?
My uncle and I think his daughter Misty and her husband Matt were driving around the roads looking for her the next morning. My aunt said she saw Misty's husband maybe around 6 or 6:30, August the 1st, driving down the little dirt road they live on. It runs off of the main road my grandmother lives on.
All right, so I guess what we're saying is there are quite a few other family members who knew about this before it got to you.
Yes.
Yeah, there was like 3 or 4 people. There was like 3 or 4 degrees of separation between somebody who figured out she was missing and yourself.
Right. And yes.
Okay.
Even my mom.
Okay. And what did you do? Did you go over there? Did other people go over to the house? What went on on August 1st when these people realized, and we'll get to Todd here in a moment, that Barbara seemingly went on this walk and never came back? What all happened there the rest of August 1st?
So, I went, me, my niece Gretchen, and her husband at the time, went to Felton, which is where my grandmother lived and went missing from. We went out there. I actually made a post on Facebook before I even left my house and asked for people to come help us search for her if they were in the area or nearby. And, of course, asked for people to look out for her. Surprisingly, we had a big turnout, just, I think, mainly from my post on Facebook. But something odd did happen. Once everybody started getting out there, one of my cousins, which would be Misty's sister, saw my post on Facebook. At this point, they didn't even know Granny was missing.
Okay.
But they were told, she texted Misty supposedly and said, this was her words to me, hey, we're coming out to help look for Granny, and Misty said, you can, but there's no need.
Okay. All right. But everybody gets to Barbara's house. Todd is there. At that point, had he even called 911 yet?
They were calling 911 when my mom was on the phone with me around lunchtime. So I think it's around 15 hours after she had been missing.
Okay, so on August 1st is finally kind of around noontime is when Todd or somebody finally called 911 to get the police involved.
Yes.
Okay. And to this day, has there ever been any understanding between your family of why it took that long for something to happen like that, to call 911?
No, I have no idea.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to that. All right, so August 1st, so everybody's over there. She seemingly, the story goes, that she went out for this walk, and I should ask you this, when did all of you find out that she had gone on this walk? We know now that somebody allegedly saw her, but on that day, August 1st, did all of you know that she had gone out for a walk the evening before, or was that something that was discovered later?
That was what we were told when we found out she was missing. So I'm guessing they knew the next morning. I know my check on her when he come in that night before he went to bed. So all we know is when we were told she was missing, that was the story we got. She was walking down the street, and that was the last time anybody saw her. From that point, she was missing. All
right. And did all of your family, when they showed up at Barbara's house on that day, did those people showing up, did they know that she went for a walk the day before?
They knew by the time they got there, I think.
Okay.
Okay. That she had went for a walk and just vanished.
Okay. So August 1st, let's talk a little bit about August 1st in the next few days. Of course, the police get called. Tell the listeners a little bit about the searches, how many people involved, helicopters, ATVs, dogs. Where did they look? How big was the search? What is your understanding? You might not have been involved. I don't know, Amy. If you were, of course, tell your own personal experience. But what is your understanding of everybody looking for Barbara?
So, originally, we had like a volunteer fire department, I think, that come out, or somebody from the volunteer fire department to come out, and I think he mainly kind of tried to help organize the first initial search we did, where everybody that comes out before the official search and rescue teams come out, we kind of just walked arm's length apart, all over the land, that we, as far as we could. We walked all the way back to the railroad tracks. We followed the railroad tracks, from her house down. We pretty much tried to cover every area. We had ATVs, so some of us were on ATVs. Some of us were just on foot. Of course, you can only get some places on foot out there. We'd have to park and get off. But then the official search and rescue people came. There were, of course, people from all over different counties. There were 25 search and rescue dogs.
Wow.
They had drones. I do believe there was a helicopter. None of the search and rescue dogs picked up her scent. They brought out cadaver dogs. From what I understand, one of the cadaver dogs sat next to my uncle's truck. They took his truck. They took his phone. My Uncle Todd.
Okay.
They took his, his truck and his phone. But from what I understand, they couldn't, find anything to incriminate him. So he got all, of course, he got his stuff back. And since then, it's really just, that's been it. They searched for her for, I think, 3 days. it probably covered, like a few, I forgot how many miles they said they went out.
Probably pretty big area with all those people involved, and then ATVs. I mean, we're talking some square miles, right?
Yes. We even went over, myself and my niece and her fiance. We even went across the road, the highway, because the road, there's the highway. We went across the highway and even checked, the other areas across the highway for her. I know I saw one of our local canine officers from Cedartown walking the side of the highway with his canine, with his dog. So.
Okay. All right. So pretty good effort went into trying to find Barbara.
Yes.
Okay. Anything, to your knowledge, anything of hers found, any clothing or anything that possibly could have been hers, like maybe not a jacket, it's July, but you know what I'm saying. Anything that maybe they found while they were searching, piece of clothing, a shoe, anything like that even could have been hers, to your knowledge?
Nothing.
Okay. Now we have this, of course, already, this one sighting, but were there any other possible sightings of her from the evening before by anybody else?
No.
None. And I'm going to do a map analysis video for all of this so people can see kind of the area. And for the listeners, Amy's going to be getting me the address of where Barb and Todd were living, and hopefully she can give me also an idea of where the sighting was of this nephew or cousin, whoever it was that saw Barbara walking, so I can do a map analysis. But you've been there. How would you describe the area? A lot of houses, hard to search, easy to search, a lot of woods, hills, rivers, creeks. How would you describe the area?
There's a few creeks. I think there's maybe a pond or two. It's definitely wooded, most of the area. Hills, because it's a mountainous area, so there's definitely a lot of hills and stuff like that out there. So
okay, all right. So not the easiest area to search. No. Okay. Now I also have to ask you this once again. Your family's impression: was she just walking? If we're to believe that she was walking this evening before. Is it the belief that she was actually walking to go to somebody's house, or was she just going out for a walk? What any sort of conclusion your family has come to?
We, she wasn't walking towards anybody in the family's house, so we think she was just out for a walk.
Okay, so there was no actual destination. Maybe she's just going to make a big circle and come back to her place.
Right.
Okay. All right, let's move on to what we're going to call the rest of the investigation. There, I'll get deeper into a few of these things. Besides Barbara, is there anything else missing of hers? Does it seem like she took anything with her? You already told me. We'll maybe get back to the phone here in a moment. But like a purse, a jacket, anything that somebody might take on a walk. Anything else missing besides just Barbara herself?
No, nothing. Barbara and the clothes had on her back, and that was it. Okay,
so like her ID, purse, wallet, anything like that, all still at her house?
Yes. Okay,
very good. Let's talk now about this sighting. This great nephew. So when he saw her, once again, your understanding is, did he honk at her? Was he driving by? Was he walking too? What is your understanding of the sighting?
From my understanding, he was just driving home, like going home from work.
Yeah.
He lives on the same road, so he was just driving by.
Okay. Did he honk at her? Did he wave at her? Did she wave at him? Do we know?
I don't know. I'm sure he probably waved at her. Now, whether or not, he did for sure, I don't know. But I imagine he probably did wave, and she, if she did recognize him, she of course would have waved back.
Okay, so, but we don't know that for sure. He didn't, for example, his sighting wasn't as complete as I was driving around the road. I saw a woman walking on the side of the road, and I noticed it was Barbara, and I tooted as I went by. I waved, and she waved. He's never said anything as complete as that.
No, not to my knowledge. It was just he was the last person saw her when he was going down the road.
Okay. And did he come to the rest of your family with that story right away, or did it take a few days?
No, that we knew immediately, I guess, once we knew she was missing, because that was the story we all got.
Okay, so this is, for example, as you might expect, Amy, sometimes we get sightings of people and then somebody doesn't come forward till like 3 weeks later. And they're insisting it's the disappearance date, but it's been so long since the actual date, we start wondering, is the person remembering the right day or not? Okay, that's why I'm asking. Yeah. But your understanding is this is something that was known fairly quickly.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure it was probably that morning that they were looking for her, that they would have asked, have y'all seen her? And he would have said, well, I just saw her yesterday evening at 6:30 when I was on my way home,
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. And I'm not too, saying he's lying or anything, but sometimes when it comes to sightings like this, we would like a little more information. And maybe if you get to talk to him sometime soon, you can maybe ask him. Of course, this disappearance is not that old. It's not even 2 years old yet. Maybe he can remember the exact circumstances. Did he wave? Did he toot? Did he do this? Did he do that? Did he think it odd? Did he ever, for example, see her walking on that road at that time before? Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I actually did reach him before this call, so I'm hoping he does.
Okay. Great. And that might be helpful. If he's to say that, I used to see her once a week when I'd be coming home from work, I think that, then there's adds a lot more credibility, to what he's saying. And, I'm not saying he's lying necessarily. But we just would like a little more context for all of that. Okay, let's move on to Todd. Being that he's the one that was living with her, you told me, though, that, of course, this is July 31st. She's allegedly out walking, and unfortunately, we only have the person that saw this was this person we just talked about, this great nephew. But there was a story about Todd actually being out, I guess, in his car or truck that night as well. There was a sighting of him. Where and by whom?
My cousin Stephen actually saw him. He lives a little further down the road from my grandmother, and he saw him coming by his house on his way home that night at about 11 or 11:30. And he just knew specifically, it was around that time because that was his daughter's curfew and she was coming in from a date at that time.
All right. So somebody else you trust sees Todd, and Todd is out in his vehicle around 11:30 that night.
Yes. Okay.
Would this have been, once again, being that you live in the general area, would this have been in the general area where Barb would have been seen walking?
No, she was seen walking. The area he was coming from is the opposite side of the road where she was. She was seen closer to the highway. He was coming from is off of the mountain where there's like 3 different dirt roads that connect to their road.
Okay, so you would say then, in your opinion, not near each other.
Right.
How many, maybe if we were to drive between both locations, how far would it take? How long would it take?
It's a good, probably 6-7 miles or so down the road.
Okay, so maybe 10 minutes away.
Right.
Something like that. All right, so not in the same location of where she was seen walking. And I don't know if anybody really believed that Barbara went walking 6 or 10 miles that evening. Okay. All right, so Todd was out. He's driving around, and did the person say that Todd was just by himself?
Well, it was dark, so I don't know if he could think he could just see that it was his truck. I'm not sure how, far back off. I think his house probably sits a little further back off the road, so I think he just saw the truck go by and didn't see who actually was in it.
All right. Has Todd ever given any explanation of what he was doing out that night?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know if he was questioned. I don't know if anybody, told the detective they sent him out at that time. So I don't know.
All right. So, for example, when everybody showed up at Barbara's on August 1st, during the conversations they had with Todd, Todd did not say, well, you know what? I tried to go out and look for her last night and couldn't find her. So just as an example.
Right. No, not to my knowledge.
Okay, very good. Now, let's talk about, so the police wanted to search Barbara's house and property, and how did Todd feel about that?
Todd asked for a search warrant for them to search the property.
And did he eventually give a reason that he wanted this? Did we eventually, I should say, did your family or everybody find out eventually why he wanted that?
I was given a reason. I don't know that it is fact, but I was told that he had 2 pounds of marijuana in his house, or in her house, and that was why he didn't anyone on the property. Now, if it's true, I don't know for fact.
Okay, so I'll ask you this. Being that you know Todd and we don't, what your family does, would you be surprised that he had that? Of course, we know many places in the country now that's legal, but I don't know if it is in Georgia. Would that surprise you if he had that in Barbara's house?
No.
Okay, your impression of the family, overall impression of Todd, that would not be a surprise?
No.
Okay. But we should say, though, did Barbara's house and the property eventually get searched anyway?
Yes.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did the police find anything, other than that, did they find anything that could be connected, you believe, to Barbara's disappearance?
No.
Okay. Let's talk about the 911 call. We've already stated she goes missing seemingly on July 31st sometime, but it's not until noon the next day, so 15 hours, 16, 17, 18 hours after this sighting, if we're to believe it, that 911 gets called. Did Todd, or maybe even his daughter Misty, who you said were involved, have they ever given any explanation in the last year and a half as to why they didn't call sooner? Of course, she's out there. They're going to know if she's home or not, comes home before dark. Any explanation?
No.
None.
Nothing.
0. Okay. Moving on to, we have to remember that Barbara has this at least one rental property. There's money coming in. Do we know what the status of that is as of February 25th, 2023? Is somebody still living on that rental property? Are they paying the rent? Where is that money going? Is that money being saved for Barbara? Should she, of course, we hope that she, of course, pops up alive. Do you know anything about any of that?
From what I understand, Todd collects her rent money, and what happens to it after that, I don't know. I don't know if it's being put up. I doubt, since it's not going directly into her checking account, that it is. I would assume he's, probably using it to pay bills.
Well, we're not going to, I just don't want to get into that. All I'm asking you is, I guess, let me just ask you this. Has anybody recently, does Todd have access to your grandmother's banking information?
No, his daughter Misty is on her account with her.
Okay, Misty is. All right, so, okay. And has anybody recently, has Misty allowed anybody else to check Barbara's checking, banking, savings, money accounts recently, to your knowledge?
Not that we know of, no.
Okay. All right. And does Todd still live in Barbara's house? Place?
Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to this. Anybody asked to take any polygraph tests in this disappearance?
I'm not sure. I would have to ask. Verify that.
Okay, but you've not. All I'm asking as of the time we're doing this interview, have you ever heard about anybody being asked to take any lie detector tests, anything like that?
No.
Okay, so we don't have any information regarding that. If Todd or if Misty or anybody else in the vicinity, if there's any suspects, if we think there's foul play, no, we don't know anything about that. Regarding Barbara, your grandmother, and her conversations with anybody that you trust, ever any complaints about living with Todd, that, she didn't like living with him or anything like that? How were the two getting along as best as you can tell?
I don't think she ever complained about living with Todd. To my knowledge, I haven't been told, that she's said anything. So, as far as I know, everything was good. Okay,
so she never thought that, this is just an example, that Todd was ripping her off or anything like that?
No, I don't think she ever thought that.
Okay. All right, and... So she wasn't, and she wanted to stay at home too, right? And then there wasn't, if there was going to be any additional care for her, she wanted to stay at home.
Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to this. There's a story of a power of attorney regarding, and this I guess comes from your, I guess it would be great aunt, regarding a power of attorney. What is this story, Amy?
So, when my granny went missing, her sister-in-law said that she used to walk and visit with her a lot, and my uncle, I think around the time he took her phone, stopped her going down there. But one of the last visits they had together, my granny, according to her, told them that my uncle had her sign power of attorney over to him.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's true, whether the papers were filed, I don't know for a fact.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know that her, and I think I've heard that story somewhere else as well, or someone else. I think my mama said that she had heard it as well. So we don't know if that's fact, but that was something we have been told.
Okay. Being that your mother and Todd are brother and sister, has Todd ever showed your mother some sort of legal document that he could have control of Barbara's things in case Barbara died, or Barbara was incapacitated, or Barbara went missing? Has he ever showed your mother or any other siblings, of course, they would have some sort of rights to this. Has he ever showed any of them anything like that?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Let's move on to this. We've kind of glanced upon it once in a while over the course of this interview. But regarding Todd, what is his reputation in your family?
He's just, in my opinion, he is not as responsible. He's more greedy.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like.
Okay.
I don't.
Just your general opinion of Todd and your family. Would you say? Let me ask you this: would you say that your mother has a better reputation in your family than Todd does?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Has Todd ever had any problems with the law?
Yes. Todd got in trouble years ago. The 80s or 90s. He stole a truck from Kmart, and he got caught selling the merchandise that was inside the truck, and he went in prison for that.
He did. Okay. The listeners should know I've tried to look this story up. I've not been able to find it. How old, by the way, is Todd now, approximately?
I would say in his 50s, maybe late 50s. I don't know. He may be 60. I'm not sure. I know my mom is in her maybe mid-60s, and he's younger.
Okay. And this Kmart story, this truck story, do you have even an idea of what year this occurred? Was this 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago?
I would say at least 30. Probably maybe a little more. I was a kid. I do remember maybe 30 years ago him being in prison, and because I do remember going to visit him in prison with my mama, when he was locked up. So, and I was probably 11 or 12 then.
Okay. All right. So this goes way back. What about more recently? Let's say within the last 10 years. Would you say that he has stayed out of trouble in the last 10 years, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, yes.
Okay. But I just want to make something clear, though, and I think we've already covered this, but we're just going to make sure that we were as fair can be. Had Barbara not gone missing, do you think there would have been any changes in the arrangement with Todd living with your grandmother and him taking care of her?
Yes, I think it would have changed.
It would have changed.
Yes,
but,
I think so.
All right, but would it have changed simply because Barbara's condition maybe was getting worse and not necessarily because of anything Todd was doing?
Yes, that's exactly why. I think because as she was getting worse, everybody needed more care than what he was able to give her. He worked, so he didn't have somebody there for her 24 hours like she really needed. So I do feel forward at some point there would have been a change in order to get 24-hour care and keep her safe.
All right, I guess what I'm saying here is that if the condition situation was going to change, it was not because Todd was ignoring her or abusing her or anything else. Right. It was simply because maybe she was getting to a point, maybe it was just too much for any regular person to handle.
Right, yes.
All right, because he's not a medical professional. He's not a nurse or anything, right?
Yes.
All right, so somebody who more understands the situation. We know people who have Alzheimer's and dementia, as their mental abilities deteriorate, they can get nasty and everything else, and it certainly can be very difficult on family members. Although I've not personally experienced that in my life, but I certainly know it to be true. So this is something maybe your family was concerned about. This is no reflection on Todd, though. Okay. How hard has the last year and a half been? Of course, I'm talking to you. You're kind of heading this up. You're getting this out there in the media. Amy, how hard has this all been, for your family? And maybe we should start here. How has Todd handled the last year and a half, being that his mother, who he was living with, has been missing? How has he handled it?
When I've seen him, I've seen him, out in public a couple times. He smiles and speaks, and he seems okay, which I think everybody probably acts okay. But deep down, I don't really know how anybody truly feels, except for myself. So, but when you see people, everybody looks okay, I guess.
Right. Okay. What about you, the rest of your family, your mother, and maybe Barbara's other children? How have they handled all this?
My mama, she puts on a brave face every day. I admire her because if I was in her shoes, even though it's my grandmother, it's not my mama missing, you know, and I just don't know that I could put on a brave face and, you know, get up and go to work and do everything that she does. You know,
yeah.
I feel like I would probably just be in bed crying, you know, and just, if it was my mama, you know, it's hard enough being my grandmother, but I can only imagine that it's probably 10 times harder, 100 times harder on my mom.
Right. That's right. Maybe you can also talk about your firsthand experience. Maybe you've talked to somebody, of course you were Barbara's grandchild, maybe you've talked to some other of the other grandchildren about this. What have they all said? You know, how have they reacted to it? You know, compare and contrast with your own feelings.
Everybody just seems to want closure. That's kind of the general thing. I know I talk to probably my nieces more than anybody when it comes to my granny, and we all just want closure. We want peace. You know, we want her to be at peace, and I just feel like until, you know, something happens, nobody's going to have any peace. We're not going to have any closure. You know, we don't have a grave to go to. We don't have anything. So, and, you know, every day, for me, every day I just sit and wonder, you know, what happened. And a million things go through my mind. Personally, I've had dreams about her since she's been missing. I dream about being in town and at a store, you know, and her walking up to me with random people. I've had dreams about her when she was younger. You know, it's unreal. And, you know, there's really nobody other than family that we can talk to. You know, most people haven't been in our shoes. You know, most people don't have a missing family member, so it's hard mentally. It's draining and exhausting. So that's why, you know, I don't know how my mama, you know, does what she does every day, because mentally it's draining for me, because I'm always constantly wondering, you know, where she's at, what's happened to her.
Yeah.
When are we going to know something? Are we going to know something? Will we ever have closure?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, we just have to remember this. Maybe you don't know this, Amy, but the listeners certainly do. That my job is to make sure, as best as I can, being a member of the media, a researcher, investigator, certainly a person who can give good advice to people like yourself, that my job is to make sure that the disappearance doesn't go for another year, another 2 years, another 3 years, another 5 years, because you need to understand that the average age of a disappearance I cover on Unfound is like 20 years old. Now, we have covered certainly some fairly recent disappearances on Unfound, which maybe brings down that average a little bit, but it's still around the 20-year mark, and I always see that as my job to do the best I can with this podcast to make sure, of course, Barbara's and everybody else's doesn't get to 20 years old. And, you know, I've had people on the podcast who have said, you know, when it was a couple years, disappearance was a couple years old, I was thinking, oh, we'll never get to 10 years, and then it gets to 10 years. Oh, we'll never get to 15 years, and it gets to 15 years. And so it's all very sad. It's all very sad, especially when you have an older woman like this who seemingly goes out for a walk and never comes back, and you start thinking, did she walk off into the woods somewhere not knowing what she was doing? I'm sure that's gone through your head, your family's minds and going to go through a lot of the listeners' minds as well. But maybe there's maybe another explanation for a disappearance. Do you have a Facebook page, website, anything set up for Barbara's disappearance? If so, why don't you tell the listeners about it right now, Amy?
We do not. But I have actually, since I have decided to start working on putting her information out there. That is one thing I had on my to-do list. So I will get one of those set up.
Yeah, you should do that. It certainly raises the profile of any disappearance. If, for example, if you were to have, find Barbara McCray or Barbara McCray missing, something like that, if you were to start a page like that, I think that would certainly help you out quite a bit. And also, I was just discovering today in preparation for this interview that she's not yet on NamUs either. So you need to, I just don't, maybe unless I missed it, I put her last name in there. And there were McCrays that come up, but not her. So you need to work on that, get together with local law enforcement, or you can just even go to namus.gov, and call them up and let them know. Maybe that can get started. Because has anybody in your family given DNA yet?
I don't know if they took any for when they initially did.
Probably not. That usually takes, they're not going to do that right away. They usually let a disappearance go unsolved for a while before they do that. I'm guessing you probably would know. Probably somebody would have told you by now that happened, because that's very important. If, for example, if remains were found in the area, probably they would be Barbara's given the location and everything, but you can never be too sure. So that's how they would be able to quickly determine if it was she or not. So you want to get her onto NamUs and get the science part of this started as well. Something important to do. Maybe put that on your list. Any final words before we complete this interview?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you, putting this story out there for me.
You're very welcome. That's what I do, and I certainly hope this helps.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And that was my February 23rd, 2023 interview with Amy Coleman, granddaughter of Barbara McCray. I thank Amy for joining me and all of you on this episode. And yes, that is the fourth Amy this year. I have no explanation for it. The accompanying map analysis is now available on Unfound's channel on YouTube. Please watch it to help you better understand Barbara's disappearance. Maybe we should not be surprised, but like many other disappearances of this type, and I named some of them in the opening, David Hardy Jr., Robert Cox, Shelva Rafty, Shanna Boydo, there is a specter hanging over Barbara's disappearance that maybe she didn't wander off at all. That could have something happened at home, and there was a cover-up. That is not to say that there could have been foul play. The fact is that Barbara was 83 years old. She had dementia. Accidents happen. And dare I speculate, we might envision a scenario of Barbara falling down when nobody is home, and Todd comes back to the house to find Barbara deceased. And he covers it up because he feels responsible, or there was something he did that caused Barbara's accident. Possible, although I'm not sure how probable. Furthermore, what may push the uninitiated to unfound public toward a scenario such as this one, or worse, is that they think if a search is unsuccessful, then the missing person isn't out there, meaning they default to foul play. This is wrong. When a search is unsuccessful, all that means is that the person hasn't been found yet, whether due to foul play, accident, or anything else. In fact, as we know, a search can be done and nothing is found. A few years later, another search is done in the same area, and someone discovers the missing person's remains. This happens all the time. And this is why I raised the issue in the summary. Do we need to totally rethink how searches are conducted? Me? I certainly believe so. But my observations over the last 6.5 years tell me that the powers that be don't want to go that distance. Whether walking, running, crawling, or anything else. If you'd like to read and hear more of my thoughts on Barbara's disappearance and the current state of searching in the 21st century, please sign up at patreon.com/Unfound Podcast. You can really help what we do here. Now, I leave the public theorizing up to you. And that's the program. Right now, while you are in your podcast platform, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, wherever, give Unfound a 5-star review, a thumbs up, whatever that platform allows. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've just finished this episode of Unfound.